Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we continue my top 100 board games of all time. Last time we covered games numbers 60 through 51. Today we're going to be talking about games numbers 50 through 41. We're finally breaking in to the top 50 of my 100 games of all time. So without any further ado, let's get straight to the list. My number 50 game of all time is A Gauntlet of Fools, designed by Donald X. Vaccarino. This game is out of print, as is the case with many of the games on my top 100, unfortunately. It's also a game designed by Donald X. Vaccarino, who I have mentioned a time or two. This game is a fantasy-themed game where players they're selecting a different assortment of heroes, or actually they're each going to be controlling one hero, and they're going to go through a dungeon, and the dungeon is represented by a deck of cards, and these decks, or this deck, consists of different fantastical races of creatures or different perils or encounters that the players are going to have to overcome throughout the course of the game. Now, the players are going to the end game trigger is either running through that deck or each of the players being knocked out because they sustained more damage than their current health or hit points. Now, at the beginning of the game, there's going to be a draft of sorts where we are going to randomly display a certain amount of heroes equal to the amount of players, and each hero is also going to have a card that represents a weapon, again, equal to the amount of heroes or the players in the game. And there's so much variety as to the initial setup because you're not always going to have the same heroes in the game, you're not always going to have the same weapons, and you're not going to always have the same combination of the two. And as you're drafting, players are factoring in the combination of the hero and the weapon and trying to consider or assess which character is the strongest, which character is the weakest, and which are in between as they try to obtain or acquire these different heroes and weapons so that they can select them and take them into the game with them. Here's the thing, here's the catch. Once you have chosen a hero and his corresponding weapon, a subsequent player in the draft order can choose to take that chosen character away from you. However, they're going to have to take a handicap, if you will. And the game provides a lot of different handicaps where it reduces either your health or it reduces the amount of dice that you roll in encounters. So that's something to consider. You're going to get this character who's really strong, who you're very interested in, but you're going to handicap him a bit if you want to. Now, as the players continue to go around, the original player can choose to get that character back. However, they're going to have to add a secondary handicap. And that's something to consider because once you handicap these characters too many times, even the stronger ones start to become weak. So that's part of the game before the game. And it's probably the most enjoyable game because it's very funny seeing how some powerful characters get nerfed as we go around and each player chooses to add an additional handicap to that character. Sometimes you're better off getting one of the in-between characters, perhaps not the weakest. But after that, you go into it, you roll dice to resolve different encounters and combats and what have you. And once you are knocked out, you're out of the game, but you might not necessarily have lost because the goal of the game is to be the player with the most gold or the most treasure at the end of the game after all other players have been knocked out. The longer you last, you do increase your chances, but again, no guarantee. Always have such a fun time with the game before the game, the drafting is so much fun, seeing the different combinations of heroes and weapons, always exciting to experience. My number 50 board game of all time, A Gauntlet of Fools. Now we move on to my number 49 board game of all time, and that is King of Tokyo. And I don't need to say much about this game. This game is a classic at this point. It's a competitive game between 2 to 6 players. It's a dice rolling game, Yahtzee style. You get up to 3 rerolls. And basically, players represent these different fantastical creatures trying to take over the area of Tokyo. And as you're playing, there are 2 potential winning conditions. Either be the first player to knock out all the other players in the game, that is, reduce their health to 0, or if you cannot accomplish that, be the first player to accomplish 20 victory points. So there are victory points in this game. And I find that the varying victory conditions makes this game so easy to teach, introduce, and present to other people. Not to mention the fact that the mechanisms are pretty streamlined, pretty intuitive, but also the fact that you have this alternate passive victory and that the more aggressive players that would be attracted to that kind of thing would be excited about the potential of knocking out all of their opponents. And the more passive players would love the opportunity to just acquire victory points and outmaneuver and out-strategize everybody else. Really cool, fun game. My number 49 board game of all time, King of Tokyo. Now we move on to my number 48 game of all time. And this is a game, the game is Smash Up, and this is a game that I learned many, many years ago, played it a few times, and had some bad experiences, particularly because I faced defeat. That did not help me, and I just found it to be too mean, but at the same time, it has some interesting mechanisms to it. Players are contending for these different areas. It's a little bit of an area control, if you will, represented by these different cards. And some of the areas are more valuable than others. Some score you more victory points than others. And basically, that's how you win the game. You get to a certain amount of victory points. There's a threshold. Whoever gets that threshold first will be the victor, will be the winner. Here's the thing. I played recently in the last year or so, and I've played with the Marvel expansion. I'm a big Marvel fan, as you have seen and probably will continue to see in my top 100 list. And first of all, thematically speaking, I enjoyed it so much more. And I was able to get into the spirit of the game. Sometimes I met defeat. Sometimes I did not meet defeat. But I enjoyed the area control, area majority type of mechanism that goes on in this game. And the combat and the interesting combos. Players are taking two different factions and they're smashing them up. 20 cards apiece, and that's going to represent their deck. So there are lots of combinations because they have released so many expansions across so many different intellectual properties, across so many different genres of entertainment and fiction and fantasy. So there is so many options as far as the deck building is concerned, or the smashing up of the decks goes. Really cool. I just enjoy the game. It's short, it's simple, it can be a little bit mean. My number 48 board game of all time, Smash Up. Now we move on to my number 47 board game of all time, and that is Lord of the Rings, the Living Card Game. And this game is designed by Nate French, published by Fantasy Flight Games. It is about 14 years since its original release. It is still going on strong. It is one of the few LCG living card games of the Fantasy Flight model, or the Fantasy Flight catalog, that have remained consistently in print and continues to produce original or new content expansions for the game. So that's impressive. Now, me personally, I actually do not own too much for Lord of the Rings. I own one of the bigger box deluxe expansions, and I think I have like 6 different scenario packs, not to mention 2 copies of the base game. But I like the cooperative, or in my case, solo experience of going through these different adventures and trying to accomplish it. I like how Nate French has created a system that has been piggybacked by other cooperative games from the same company. And basically, you play this game, this tactical card game, very much in the spirit, in the vein of games like Magic the Gathering. However, you could play it all by yourself, or you could have a teammate and go about it cooperatively doing that. The deck building is fun. You have all of these different spheres of influence that represent different categories that you will include in your deck, and you're going to pick one at the beginning of the game, or you might have multiple if you want to weaken how strong you'll be in one of these aspects or another. If you're playing with one more player or multiple players, you can include more of these spheres, which increases the chances of you being able to react to all the different scenarios or all the different challenges that a particular scenario can present. So the game does become a little bit more manageable at the higher player counts, albeit a longer game as well. But I just enjoy it. I like the Lord of the Rings Middle-earth universe. I just have fun playing this game. I could play it solo. I could play it cooperatively. My number 47 board game of all time, Lord of the Rings, the Living Card Game. Now we move on to my number 46 board game of all time, and that is Shadow Rift. And Shadow Rift is a fantasy-themed deck building game that I have enjoyed. And one of the things I like about Shadow Rift, first of all, it's a very difficult game. This is like a tower defense, village defense game. Your village is being overwhelmed by all of these dangerous, fantastical creatures or fantastical beings from another dimension that have traveled over to your dimension and to your village through these shadow rifts that have been opened and that you need to seal. The goal of the game is to seal. It's not necessarily to beat the big bad or to beat the boss. It's actually to seal the different shadow rifts. You have to seal 2 different shadow rifts that are represented by a card apiece in the deck, and you have to wait till you get to them, and you also have to have the right resources or the right cards in your deck and in your hand in order to be able to seal them before you sustain too much damage to your village and to your villagers. What I like about this game is that it's not only deck building, but there's multiple decks that you have to manage. You have a villagers deck, which represent the population of your city, and as that deck diminishes because they're being picked off like flies and they're being replaced by corpses, if your entire village row is represented by corpses, you have lost the game. So that's something you have to do. You have to continue to like recruit additional cards into the village deck. You also have, of course, your own individual player deck, and you're also manipulating the scenario deck and trying to get to the cards that are more favorable, or I should say less detrimental to you as you manipulate that scenario deck. It's just a fun game. I have a good time playing it. My number 46 game of all time, Shadow Rift. Now we move on to my number 45 board game of all time, and that is Call of Cthulhu, the living card game. And this is another living card game from the Fantasy Flight line of games. This game is out of print, unlike Lord of the Rings, the living card game. I find that all the LCGs from Fantasy Flight that are competitive in nature, typically 2 players, 1v1, sometimes they include multiple players, but either way, when they are competitive, for whatever reason, they have a shorter shelf life. These games tend to cycle from 3 to 6 years, and then they're gone, they're forgotten, out of print with no further content. However, their cooperative games are working. Now, I will give a spoiler here. There will be no Arkham Horror, the living card game, above this. I have grown cold on that game for many, many reasons, but this game here, Call of Cthulhu Living Card Game, is my Cthulhu Mythos choice of game for the LCG style game. And it's a competitive game in nature. And I like the fact that it feels very different than the other competitive LCGs in the Fantasy Flight catalog. I particularly am a fan of even the competitive LCGs in Fantasy Flight. There might be other LCGs higher on the list than this one here, but I like the fact that it feels distinct from the other games. I like the fact that players have their own different domains that they're going to be building up to use as resources in order to buy cards, and they're going to be increasing the value of each of these domains. They're building their deck in 2 different types or 2 different factions, kind of like Smash Up, and they're between those 2 factions, they will build the cards that they need for their deck, and they will go one against another. It's a little bit like, the more I think about it, it's a little bit like Smash Up in the sense that you have these different cards which represent the missions, and players are trying to, I guess, get a little bit of a majority there because they are trying to place their clue tokens one by one as they experience the success in the different battles. And once you've filled out the card with all the necessary clue tokens, you will acquire that. And once a player has won a certain amount of these missions, they will be the winner of the game. So now that I'm thinking about it and explaining the game, I see the similarities between the 2. But I would definitely pick Call of Cthulhu, as you can see, higher than Smash Up. Just a fun game. If you like Cthulhu Mythos and you do not mind looking into out-of-print games that might be a little bit harder to find, you might have to go to eBay or the Geek Market on Board Game Geek. If you do not mind the pursuit of such a game, you might want to look into it. My number 45 game of all time, Call of Cthulhu, the living card game. Now we move on to my number 44 board game of all time, and that is Temporum. And this is yet another Donald X Vaccarino game. And this game is probably the simplest of all the games that I've talked about as far as Donald X Vaccarino goes. It's very reminiscent of Dominion if you look at its graphic design, its artwork. As a matter of fact, it is made by Rio Grande Games, just as Dominion was. So there is a reason, I guess, behind why they look so similar. But you're basically, it's like time travel. That's the theme of the game. And you're going back into antiquity, deep into antiquity, and you're trying to change all these different things so that in the future, you guys, all the players represent different factions from like a dystopian future, so that in the future, your faction can reign supreme. And you're advancing along this track that shows how much influence you have or your faction has. And once you get a certain amount of influence for your faction, your team or your player wins the game. But throughout the course, you're just doing some simple card play. You are maneuvering your player piece from one timeline to another, and there's branching timelines, which I find to be very thematic from a time travel perspective. And you're taking the different actions, which really is just actions such as advancing your influence, drawing new cards, because the more cards you have, the more options you'll have for the actions you could take, spending cards in order to increase your influence, spending cards in order to gain money, which will help you trigger other actions later on in the game. Simple yet fun, with an interesting theme, albeit not the greatest graphic design as far as the board goes, but I do like the cards. My number 44 board game of all time, Temporum. Now we move on to my number 43 board game of all time, and I guess there's a reoccurring theme here because it's another LCG, and that is Warhammer 40,000 Conquest, the living card game. Another out-of-print LCG with the Warhammer 40K theme, and I enjoy this game. Basically, characters, players are very similar to Call of Cthulhu in the sense that you have these different areas, except in Call of Cthulhu, you have 3 areas at a time, and they get replaced as players conquer one of them or what have you. You have these 7 different areas, and at the beginning of the game, most of them are face down, and players are vying for control or influence in each of these 7 areas, and you're playing, you know, combat style, tactical card game, playing cards. Your cards battle your opponent's cards. They deal you damage, you deal them damage. They get knocked out, you get knocked out, and all this stuff. But what happens is, as you win an area, because you have a certain amount of influence there or what have you, you gain that card, you put it into your victory pile. But the thing is, what happens is each area has 1 or 2 or maybe even up to 3 different color-coded icons. And you win the game by being the first player to get, I believe it's 3 of one type of color. So you might win a particular location, and you might allow your opponent to win another location. You might not even try to put all your eggs into that other basket, because at the end of the day, that second location does not have the icons that you've been striving towards all game long for your victory. So you might want to like play it cool there and invest somewhere else as the other different locations get revealed, and you see a location that does include the icons that you have been working towards. It's really fun. You have all these different factions which represent the different races from the 40K lore. Really interesting. My number 43 board game of all time, Warhammer 40 Conquest. Now we move on to my number 42 board game of all time, and that is Dice Masters. And this is a game that I'm not as into as I was at one point. At the same time, I'm a little bit more into it in recent years than I was a few years back. So it's a game that kind of cycles in and out for me as far as my excitement for the game. I do see its limitations, but at the same time, I appreciate the things that I do enjoy about the game so much that quite often it rises very high on my rankings, such as 42. Now, let's talk about the game. First of all, this game originally was published in 2014, and originally it had a Marvel theme, Marvel Comics, Marvel superheroes. Then they had a DC Comics iteration. They also had Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They have had wrestling. They have had Yu-Gi-Oh! They have had a couple different IPs. I believe they even had Dungeons and Dragons. I've only owned content for Marvel and for DC. Marvel's my favorite intellectual property, my favorite brand of comics and superheroes. I own almost everything for Marvel, and I own a decent chunk for DC as well. And basically, this is a dice version of Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering, which has made it on my list previously, and you guys could check older videos to see where it ranks. But this game here is a dice version of Magic the Gathering, where you have lots of the same elements of battling each other. You're trying to knock down the player's health, but their different characters kind of serve as buffers or protection from their health. So you're trying to knock out their characters, so eventually you could get to them. The defending player gets to choose who they defend with, or even if they will defend. Each individual dice represents a superhero, and each superhero has its card, its hero card that's associated with it, or each supervillain. It could be a supervillain as well. And the card will tell you the dice will tell you the stats, how much they hit with, how much they could defend for, but the card will tell you any additional abilities they might have. Now, I will say this, it could be a lot more frustrating than Magic the Gathering, because while with Magic, you're always susceptible to the luck of the draw, here you also have to factor in dice rolling. And while it does grant you every turn, you are granted 1 reroll, That quite often is not enough. I do sometimes wish that it was Yahtzee style where you get up to 3 rerolls, but I get it. It might have made the game too simple. So yes, quite often you are frustrated, but just drafting the different heroes at the beginning of each game to see who's going to set it up, building your dice pool because it's a dice pool that you grow. You start with a bag. It's a bag building game with just basic standard sidekick dice, they will call them. Very weak, very limited. As the game progresses, you are drafting these individual dice that represent the characters or the heroes and villains that you drafted at the beginning of the game, and they will strengthen your pool of dice as you go forward. Really interesting, really wonderful theme. My number 42 board game of all time, Dice Masters. And now we move on to my number 41 board game of all time, the last board game for this video, and that's Deception Murder in Hong Kong. And this is a party style game. I've had a few throughout the course of my top 100. This game here is so much fun. It's a game where players are all representing a group of, say, investigators who are investigating a crime. One player is going to take on the role of the forensic scientist, and they're going to basically know from the beginning of the game that one of the players around the table is actually the secret murderer, and they've committed the crime. And they're going to know that, and they're going to be giving hints. Here's the thing, they cannot speak, they cannot use body language. Honestly speaking, they should avoid eye contact if possible. They're simply placing these bullet-shaped pieces on these different tiles that have different options for clues. And by giving these clues to the players, they're gonna try to make the players arrive to the conclusion of who was it that did it. And you get three rounds of giving clues. And after the third round, players have to give their guess. And if every player fails to accurately guess not only who did it, but what particular weapon they used and what other key evidence. You have two different cards. Each player is going to have a set of cards representing potential murder weapons and a set of cards representing potential key evidence. And you need to be able to guess the combination of the player, the key evidence, and the murder weapon. If you do not get all three correctly, it doesn't matter if your hunch was right, if you were on the right track, you have lost the game. So it's a great game because even if you're not the greatest at body language, because I know a lot of people I play these type of games with, secret characters, hidden identities, and all that stuff, and they do not like playing the game because they'll tell you, I'm the worst at body language. I have no poker face. Well, guess what? You can be terrible if you pick the right nuanced weapon or the right subtle choice for your key evidence at the beginning of the game, and they blend in with all the other cards around you or even other players' cards. It makes it so much harder for the forensic scientists to put those clues together. It makes it so much harder for the other investigators to figure out exactly who did it and with what they did it, and you might get away with a victory. And I have seen it with my own eyes where players knew for a fact based on the body language who had done it, but they could not actually solve the crime. My number 41 board game of all time, Deception Murder in Hong Kong. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below. Tell me what you think about this set of 10 games. Tell me which games you enjoyed from this 10. Tell me which games you're surprised made it this high. I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. Until next time, when we come back with our games number 40 through 31, I'll see you then, guys. Take care, stay healthy, stay safe, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.